Thank you very much. So I follow from Dr. Borbor's paper to concentrate on the city of Tehran and the planning process in Tehran. I covered a century and a half just to show how the city has been evolving. The context of this has been the emergence of a large metropolis, and you could look at it at different speeds. On the one hand, you have the human capacity that is growing, population, finance, knowledge, skill, talent, aspiration. So you have a big city with all of that. But lagging behind that is the capacity to nourish this, to the institutional, spatial, and cultural capacity to nourish it, to mobilize it, to respond to it. So we have growth of capacity, lagging, if you like, ability to respond to that. And that creates lots of tensions, which we see in revolutions, in social upheavals. Now, city planning is one of those ways of addressing this lag. And it happens usually during the periods of stability, when the political system has been fairly stable, the situation is fairly economically stable. And we see the connection with that, with the global economic conditions, because Iran, through its oil economy, is integrated in the global economy, even if it tries to be very isolated. And then what we see then is interplay of this historic continuity, disruptive modernity, and emerging necessity, which I'll try to explain. So I organized my talk along these lines. Since the middle of the 19th century, we see three approaches to shaping the city of Tehran, through intervention, regulation, and negotiation, and I'll explain what I mean. And they are, in a way, it's chronological, but also cumulative. And what we see, there are elements of them that are contradictory. And they reflect the changing nature of the state and its relation to the city and to the environment. Basically, planning is an activity of the powerful, the state, that tries to shape the city. So first is the intervention, and by that I mean direct state intervention in the construction of infrastructure, like roads, like housing estates, neighborhoods, townships, urban development projects, urban renewal projects, direct intervention of the state. The first one of this type of thing in Tehran is what establishes Tehran as a city, which is in the 16th century when the Safavid dynasty builds a wall around it and makes it the summer capital of the Safavid kings. But what you see in the middle of the 19th century, this is a medieval urban form. And then what we have, the first event of planning or shaping the city by direct state intervention, is this Nasiri wall, Nasiruddin Shah, in the middle of the 19th century, which they try to modernize through expansion of the walls, through introduction of the streets, through organization, a bringing of new institutions and new activities. So it is a complete change of the urban environment, which happens at that time. I don't go through the details of that because probably I won't have time. But I've listed the sort of things that you see happening at the time, that there is a movement for reform and movement for change that starts in the middle of the 19th century, which is parallel to other reform movements, let's say in Japan, in Turkey. There is a big movement for reform at that time. And what you see is the emergence of new institutions like this Institute of Higher Education, Dar al-Fanun, banks, new gates and walls that are more decorative than functional. But this is a quote from Lord Curzon, who was Viceroy of India and at that time visiting Tehran. And he says, and he's got a book in 1892 about Tehran, about Iran, the Persian Question, I think it's called. The visitors in the first half of this 19th century would barely recognize the city. And this is the second stage of a twofold renaissance. So the city completely has changed its image, its organization, through this radical reform that we see. But this period comes to an end with the Constitutional Revolution of 1906 to 1911, and the Great War, the first World War a century ago. The second phase of radical change in the city is the 1930s, the Pahlavi street pattern. And this image is from this wonderful atlas that Dr. Urkad and colleagues at Tehran University and Tehran municipality have produced. I'm going to use several of those maps that are very well produced. And it's a wonderful atlas. This is the beginning of Pahlavi dynasty, centralization of power, beginning of the oil economy, expanding of it. It's the project of unification of space, which happens at the national space by road building, by suppressing the regional factional powers, and by concentrating on the center. So centralization, bureaucratization, establishment of new institutions, and application of that to the urban space. The city is now an integrated. Walls are disappearing, have disappeared. A road network is imposed, as we saw in Hamadan. This happens everywhere in Iran, but the biggest of them is in Tehran. And it opens the city for what is going to happen. It is the foundation of what happens later. Again, in this period, we have new institutions, army and bureaucracy, and this is a period, an interesting period. They are trying to establish a modern national identity, but in doing that, they go back to ancient Iranian imagery, they go back to Islamic imagery, they go back to, they use European imagery, all of these emerging at the time. But there is a new sense of space that emerges. People talk about the Reza Shah period as a period of disruption, but there are also lots of continuities that are re-established in the same sense that perhaps Safavid had tried to re-establish their connections to the ancient past. This new dynasty tries to do the same. And the process of establishing landmarks, this direct intervention of the state is in this, the landmark in the Qajar period, the Sepah Salar Mosque, landmarks in the Pahlavi period of this Azadi monument, and in the Republic period with this Milad Tower. So there is a process of signification of power and introduction of new imagery for the time. And also you see it in the establishment and construction of the squares. These are all from the central square of Tehran, Tubkhane, Artillery Square, which you see in the Qajar period in the 19th century. It looks like that on the top, and then in the Pahlavi period it's modern European architecture there, and even a further modern European architecture in the second Pahlavi period. And it comes to, during the Republic, now there are projects for reviving some of the historic character of the area. And the roads. Other than the road network of the 1930s, the bottom right is the Parkway, which was the kind of late second Pahlavi period, and then the top one is the modern network of roads that you see. These are all government projects implemented, imposed on the urban fabric. And the interesting thing is about the road network is based on the plan of the Pahlavi period. And then the metro construction, which has been very successful and expanding, very much needed in the city. And now that was road infrastructure, in a sense, mobility infrastructure that was created. The second category of this direct intervention is through neighborhoods and towns. We heard about Charsad Dastgah, we heard about Narmak, Ekbatan in the 1970s, and a group of new towns around the city, of which Pardis is one, and several planned and several in the construction. Pardis is a new town to the northeast of the city. As you see, it's the scale is completely different. They are not necessarily finding people who want to live there, but they are building these buildings. And Maskan Mehr, which is the kind of President Ahmadinejad project. Again, direct intervention by the state to provide neighborhoods. And it's controversial, continues to be controversial, especially after the recent earthquake. There's another aspect of this direct intervention is urban renewal. This is the Nawab project, which is a massive project that hasn't been repeated yet in the city, but it's basically creating a motorway through the city, reorganizing the urban buildings into these towers. It goes through the process of land assembly. Now, I have a PhD student who is working on small-scale land assembly and participation projects, much smaller scale and much more sensitive to the surrounding. The second form of planning, so this is the sort of city planning, old style, direct intervention, big investment, big change of the city. The second is what generally is considered to be planning, technically speaking, and is land use planning. It's through legal and institutional framing of environmental development, of urban development. This is what was in the early 1950s. This is what the city was like. And these images that I'm showing you are taken from Doxiades' study of Tehran in the 1970s. And you see, this is 1956 with a population of 1.5 million. And you see how in 10 years it becomes 2.8 million, and in 20 years it's 3.7 million. It's expanding, it's enlarging in population and size. And what we see is by the 1970s, you see how it has grown from the 1930s. It's a massive expansion of the city. Rapid urbanization, this is the period of Cold War after the coup d'etat. This is the period of much unregulated development, rising revenues, and more active involvement by the state in the marketplace. So there's a context for planning, for master planning. There's a major seminar in the 1960s, and they ask for some sort of mechanism to govern and give order to this expansion. And these are some of the quotes from that document, that the buildings have cropped up everywhere without any sort of coordination. The city of Tehran is a collection of various pieces, basically. And those are from Mr. Nafisi, who is the father of the famous novelist, Al-Azhar Nafisi. And then the plan organization is introduced as the framework for managing this development, of foreseeing the planning of the country and the economy and the cities. Although plan organization is not directly involved in city planning. But it becomes a government within a government, as I'm quoting the Harvard economist Ed Mason. Not only a government, but largely a foreign government, because it draws on a lot of foreign advisors. So the master plan of 1968 is organized in this way, thinking the city as it is, the big square in the middle, and its future direction in a linear way through establishment of new towns. And this remains, the master plan remains the most important document, the planning document of the city, despite various planning documents afterwards. And the road network that it had anticipated is what happened in the 1990s. They were implementing it. It had all these ideas of the time. You can compare it to the planning ideas of the time in other countries, because it was produced by Victor Gruen. Victor Gruen, an Austrian-American architect who is the father of shopping malls. And he was brought in with Mr. Farmayan, who, with Dr. Urquhart, we went to visit in Paris in his apartment and talked to him about his plan. It was an interesting combination of the two, because at the time, Iranian consultants had to have these big projects. They had to have international partners. So basically, they wanted to change the imagery of the city and change the infrastructure and shape the future. I don't have time to stay much to talk about that, but we may come back if needed. There's another plan for the city that very few people know about. This is by Doxiades. Doxiades was a superstar of planning world in the 1960s and 70s. He had planned Detroit, he had planned all sorts of new cities in Islamabad and also. But he produces an action plan which gets never implemented, and probably better for it as well. But then this period comes to an end by the Second Revolution, which you all know about. So what happens after that There is a new master plan produced in the early 90s. And this plan, the municipality doesn't like this plan, doesn't approve it, doesn't take it seriously. And they come up with their own plan, which is the first non-physical plan of the city. They call it a strategic plan, which it was, and basically establishes some goals, some general goals, and some strategies. And it is the period of the 1990s that I'll come to talk about. There is another master plan later. This master plan is one to sit on top of a number of existing plans. And therefore, it is just a kind of diagram imposed on reality. It doesn't get much implemented, cannot be implemented, because these districts all have their own plans, and this just comes in the form of a strategy. A little bit like London, that had all these 32 plans, and then when the Great London Authority was established, there is a strategic plan which cannot go beyond the diagram. So that's a long story. But what you see is the problems of governance, that the plans cannot be implemented. A large part of it is because of tensions of democratization that Dr. Bourbour talked about the establishment of the councils, the problem of the legitimacy of the council decisions, that whether people take these seriously or follow the municipal plan, and the discussions and dilemmas about technocracy, theocracy, democracy, all of these things that are running in the country. The role of civic associations and public forums, the problems of relation with the central government, the fragmentation of regional governance, because beyond the limits of Tehran, there's lots of urban development happening that is not related to Tehran through the planning process. There's no regional arrangement for that to happen. So the municipality has a very limited sphere of influence, and the problems of how the mayor is elected, the relation between Tajrish and Rey, and the relation between the municipality and consultants. All of these issues of governance and so there are all sorts of failures of land use planning in this period. The questions of events like a revolution that's put a stop to them, the speed and scale of change, which is really a challenge to anyone who want to manage anything in Iran because of the scale and the speed of challenge. High land prices that were mentioned, speculative type of development, some of the old concepts of planning, so they survive in the planning profession, ineffective implementation that we heard about, cultural attitudes to regulation, and the court's attitude. The courts don't recognize much planning regulations. They say Islamic law allows you to develop as you wish. It is your land, do it. So it's a kind of conflict of planning regulations with the courts, with the system of the country. So the third model, which comes along, so the first model was since time immemorial, let's say, but primarily from the 1860s. The second one from the 1960s. The third one is from the 1990s. It is the approach of capturing value in a market-led development. So the role of planning becomes minimized. The role of planning becomes updated, modernized, a little bit like what happens here. That planning becomes marketing for development or going along with development rather than trying to restrict it, trying to control it too much. So what you see is privatization, decentralization, entrepreneurialism, all of these things that you see in the 1980s and 90s in European countries, in the UK, you see the same sort of commonalities with the British, with the Iranian situation. The scale of development, planning regulations are relaxed. The whole process becomes negotiating with developers, allowing them to develop at higher densities, but capturing the value. Now, that's a kind of development tax, but it's so unpopular in Iran, they call it selling density. And it's because it's not regulated as such. It is somehow felt to be a kind of on-the-table arrangement rather than a part of a development tax put on any development. It's a kind of bonus zoning that you see in New York of the 1970s. But in New York of the 1970s, any development still had to be judged on the basis of its impact on the neighbors and that sort of thing. It doesn't happen in Iran. So a lot of things about relationship of the development to the infrastructure, relationship of the development to its neighbor, all of these things are relaxed or ignored. So the impact is huge. Infrastructure, neighbors, green space disappearing, quality of life of the city going down. But it is a way of meeting the demands of this growing metropolis, going upwards. It is undermining the legitimacy of the planning process. There's some attention to the quality of the urban environment in these new developments, but you see that the limits of growth. The picture to the left is from the master plan of Tehran, 1960 master plan. You see, this is the city, and the mountains are so far away. But now you see in the 2000s, basically the city is going up the hills, up the mountains. There's limited. There's no more space to develop. After the earthquakes and air pollution, traffic congestion, political upheavals, and these sorts of things, there has been a discussion of relocating the capital, which basically, if you look at down there, is the earthquake fault lines of the city of Tehran. And you see the old city was not on a fault line, but all the new developments, all the luxury developments are here. This is the luxury parts of the city, all sitting on big fault lines. And obviously, it's a major threat to the future of the city. But I mean, the government's solution was, rather than trying to solve the problem, is avoiding it by relocating the capital. But obviously millions of people are going to still to live in there. So it's one of those. So I'm coming to the end of my. I've got just this the last slide, which I managed to get rid of. Yes, thank you. Okay. No, that's the last one. This is the section.
No.
Oh, it's okay. That's okay.
To do that.
We can just leave it as it is. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So I told the story of the shaping of the city of Tehran in these three forms of power that the state has used to shape: direct, mediated, and emergent. Direct, by that I meant intervention to set up a spatial framework through design and construction of infrastructure. Earlier it was the walls, but then it became roads, new neighborhoods and towns, urban development projects, urban renewal projects. And this has been going on since the 1860s. Then mediated, which is through regulation. Rather than intervention, it's regulation of what happens. So it's trying to frame the development through institutional tools, through legal tools, land use planning tools. So there's been a continuity of comprehensive planning, master planning, and recently strategic planning. Although still there is a return to master planning. They call them comprehensive plans. So the technology is continued. But they are not necessarily the same thing. And then the emergent, in a sense that the institutional tools are relaxed, they're used ambiguously, it's market-led, and this is going on since the 1990s. So as you see, these are cumulative and chronological, but they don't necessarily fit together, but they all exist now. You have all of these three forms existing now and applied. There is a lag always between the growth dimensions and the ability to manage it democratically. And that's what we see also on the margins. Like any other big metropolis, the margins are outside the control of the municipality, outside the planning process. And you can see that anywhere in the world. But particularly in Tehran is really problematic, what happens, because the neighboring municipalities want to attract things, want to build things without paying any attention to any regulation, and they can do it. And also this development is aligned with major cycles of global economy, like the 1930s, 60s, 90s. You can see the periods of boom in the global economy that, because of Iran's connection to the oil economy, is synchronized. Whether you want it or not, partly is synchronized. It's also related to the waves of political economy. So you have authoritarian. In the post-war period, you have a welfarist attitude, continuing after the revolution, and you have a new liberal attitude that emerges in the 1990s. And also to the cultural attitudes that you see other places. The earlier developments and ideas are very much influenced by the Beaux-Arts mentality. Later is modernist mentality after the Second World War, and now, or at least since in the 1980s and 90s, postmodernist. Although that has changed, because it has changed almost everywhere. So you can see the mechanisms, the tools, the mentalities, the frameworks, the steps and stages of trying to shape this big giant thing that nobody can shape. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, we have time maybe for one or two questions. Dr. Baba?
I would like to talk of, there is a huge development in Western Tehran, one of the largest that I've seen in the world. And it's just amazing. You drive for kilometers and I think it's a pity you hadn't included that in it. You must visit Tehran more often. And because this development is huge and very speedily done. I occasionally go to Tehran, and each week that I go, I see that the progress is something fabulous. This is one thing. Another,
Section 22.
yes.
District 22.
And then I would like to just say a couple of words about the relocation of Tehran. This has been a very fashionable matter that crops up every now and again, and I've been interviewed several times on the subject. This is just a fallacy. You can't move Tehran to another place, and you shouldn't do that because of the cost and because there's so much infrastructure. And I have also pointed out in various interviews that several countries have changed their capitals, and they have all been unsuccessful.